You are listening to The Harboring Light. I'm Mary. I give a conservative take about the world around me. So this episode is centered around, again, me making observations about adaptations. So this time I am going to focus on the Crucible. So I'm going to address the theater, the adaptation of it versus when it's from the theater perspective onto the movie adaptation, and then also address how that correlates to something being inspired, or the retelling of something in a dramatical sense and a theatrical sense from real events. All right, so let's dive in. Okay, so Arthur Miller. I guess I guess you made it when you are referenced in pop culture. So it's quite interesting with Seinfeld. They made George, particularly the character, made a quick reference as to say about an Arthur Miller play, particularly with Death of the Salesman and his, dark off-camp humor, saying, isn't his particular plays in it, particularly with Death of a Salesman, about essentially being a loser, So that's quite interesting because of Arthur Miller's perspective and how his theatrical plays, they center around the concept of the aspect of the modernity and the aspect of modern life and how people fit into that. And then going into the aspect of the Crucible, talking about historical events, is quite interesting when it takes the path of shedding a light or making commentary about the events that were going on in his area, particularly with McCarthy hearings. And so, I'm just going to give my thoughts. I'm going to go into more detail in the later half of this episode. But with the McCarthy era, it shows the impact of what can happen with mass hysteria. And then also leading into the Salem witch trials and the aspect of using emotion, with the tolls that takes on using emotion rather than rationally seeing things for what they are. And then, of course, begs the question of that people have different thought processes throughout different eras and generations. But on the top of that, it's very important to look at things from an understanding that it's important to see humanity and and your acts of what you do. Keep that in mind when looking back about things like that. And so with that said, with the McCarthy hearings and with linking the aspect of this and to the Crucible, also the notion comes to mind about how, if you don't pay attention to history, it will repeat itself in a different manifestation. So, essentially, I'm sure other people think that too. And when you look at this, it's also sending that message too, that It's very important to pay attention to your history because, as it's coined, it can repeat itself if you don't take care of it. And so, needless to say, with this, it relates to all of the innocent lives being taken out of irrational methods of punishment, where with the Salem witch trials, which I'm referring to, and then linking that back to talking about the McCarthy era, McCarthy hearings, so many people losing their livelihood, all for not being just a hunch, or being skeptical about someone when you're not really understanding the situation. You're not really trying to get out of your own irrational thoughts. You're not trying to get out of your own stereotypes about certain things, and understanding what is, again, as I said, what's actually happening, what's actually going on, what are these people? Are these people actually communists, or are they not? What is the situation? All right, so let's get into the facts about this. Okay, so this part of the episode is about running the background of the playwright Arthur Miller, and of course the play The Crucible. So let me start out talking about The Crucible. So The Crucible is a 4-act play performed and published in was a 4-act play, but is in the essence that it still lives on. So a 4-act play by Arthur Miller, performed and published in 1953. So it's set in, as I mentioned, about Salem witch trials. In 1692, during the Salem witch trials, The Crucible is an examination of contemporary events in American politics during the era of fear and desire for conformity brought by Senator Joseph McCarthy's sensational allegations of communist subversion in high places. All right, so Arthur Miller's social playwright and social awareness came out of the concerns of his characters in the inner life, in the inner, living in cities in modern times, so to speak. What comes out of the aspect? Let me rephrase that. What the situations and what happens to people in the aftermath of society, society because of a modern era, and then how people deal with it. So, as I mentioned, Death of the Salesman is what he's best known for, but what shaped his social awareness was living through the Great Depression, which brought financial ruin to his father, a small manufacturer, and demonstrated to the young Miller the insecurity of modern existence. Okay, so Miller based The Crucible on the witchcraft trials in Salem, Massachusetts of 1692 to 93. These series of persecutions he considered were an echo of the McCarthyism of his day. He was actually investigated in these trials, and alleged subversive activities were widespread. Though not as popular as The Death of a Salesman, it won a Tony for Best Play. It was also adapted into numerous times for film and television. And particularly the one that I'm most familiar with is the one from the 90s, starring Winona Ryder. And that I think that particular adaptation of the movie, it got the essence of the mentality of the female persuasion, particularly with a young girl believing in young girls believing what they say to be true and never questioning it. And that kind of mentality, why question what is said from an innocent face, particularly from what a girl is saying. And that also begs the question and goes into the lines of the notion of this whole mentality, unfortunately, that goes along with crimes and the nature of this, particularly what I'm leading towards is the Me Too movement with believe all women and all of these sort of things. Don't go against what the allegations are. Don't look into the evidence. Don't look into questioning. Don't look into all of that. Just take everything at face value when that's not really the essence of what should be done as far as the aspect of finding the truth, and then the aspect of the judicial system. It's supposed to be, of course, the aspect of, with the blind justice, right? But with that goes to the responsibility of looking at all the evidence and taking all the different tiers of professionals to take all the precautions to make sure everything is done correctly. Now, this is, we don't live in a perfect world, and of course, the judicial system is flawed, but that goes without saying that there is a lot of things that are done correctly in the judicial system. But perpetuating the idea of saying that just believe me, what I'm saying is true, it's unfortunate because it takes away from the true victims that go through things like this. And that's really unfortunate. And that's something to think about with all of this aspect of the Salem witch trial and the Crucible. And then also into the aspect of this about McCarthyism. All right, so in 1956, when Miller was himself called before the House of the Un-American Activities Committee, he refused to name people he had seen 10 years earlier at an alleged communist writers' meeting. He was convicted of contempt, but appealed and won. So, this mass hysteria it leaked all through all aspects of society, in the essence of entertainment, the essence of science, notable scholars of science, things like that. It just leaked everywhere. And then, where does that cross the line with the aspect of having theologies about the way you see the idea of the nature of protecting your country, the patriotism, and then when it gets into the zealous factor of anything that is against our way is wrong, and condemning everything without really looking at the evidence is something to say. And then this also says a lot of aspects to Arthur Miller's moral compass, because, of course, he could have easily said and just given off the people and ways of protecting his career, but he didn't. so he run the risk of losing everything. But in the end, it worked in his favor. So that also goes to the aspect, unfortunately, of today. Of this could be a prime example to look towards, with standing up against the subversion of what's being called today as the woke mentality. So with the woke mentality, how that's ruining the aspect of what is. So it's one thing to want to see movies like that, but it's another thing when it's just being forced upon you without your asking. So this aspect of this activist movement, that we should feel bad, we should have some kind of moral complex of what of the injustices that are going on in the world, when things are even better for a society of today. And then when these type of people, these activist people, stand up and cry the loudest and bend the knee to them, it takes little by little away and shreds away and rivals down. And more of the essence of it just when you're wearing old clothing, and little by little the fabric tears down and it just breaks down, and it's no longer wearable till you have to throw everything out. And when you take a stand and say, I hear what you're saying, but I think this way, and you gotta understand not everybody agrees or sees the way that you do. It takes a whole new light and a whole new sort of, this just common sense, but common sense fails to be the center point in our society, unfortunately. But it's coming back. But needless to say, not everybody thinks this, but it's just unfortunate that most of the masses do. So it builds up the society when you take a stand and you say, no, I don't think that's the right way to believe that everyone should think your way. And it can heal. It can heal all of these issues that we're facing that we don't need to be facing. For the essence of corporations perpetuating Pride Month. Why should that be a thing? It would be weird for a straight person to say, look at me and my whole identity is my sexuality, and I want to wave and rave and just bring so much attention to my sexuality, when you should be and have more merit than that. You should want people to see you more than your sexual identity. And it's just very odd. And then you're just pushing these agendas onto children. And I mean, at one point in history, people who think like this, it would be a laughingstock in society. And it's just strange how things can just perpetuate itself back. But on the other hand, this aspect is nothing new. And it's just really important to say again that, when you look towards history and you learn from history and you keep all this in mind and you protect the importance of history, it can really pave the way to where you move and where the society moves in the future. All right, so I'm going on to the historical facts about the Salem witch trials. Okay, so in this segment, this is the last part of this episode. I'm going to focus in on the facts about the Salem witch trials, and also I'd like to know what you all think about the aspect of the Salem witch trials and mass hysteria and all of that. And then also, before I get into it, I just want to run down a bit of thoughts that I have about it too. I remember seeing back when the History Channel was actually the History Channel, all about history. But anyway, that's another subject entirely of itself. So, turns out that it was quite interesting how they broke down everything that these hallucinations and everything of what they thought these girls were doing in Salem and what they thought they saw was linked to a wheat field or wheat being essentially being contaminated and all kinds of factors about it, and that altered their state of reality. And it's very interesting when it comes down to the matter of how, mental instability and how that was the leading factor without realizing and understanding that. And on top of the aspect of holding on to imperialist thoughts without appreciating the aspect of understanding rational points of view that's not harmful to anybody. How that all links together into the just uncalled deaths and persecutions of people, and it's just it's really something to say about that. So here we are. It says, on top of giving the background about the Salem witch trials, I'm also going to talk about 6 facts that are not really known about the Salem witch trials. So, the Salem trials were a brutal and misunderstood event in the history of the United States. And, of course, this source will be provided for you in this episode. So, as I'm reading according to the source, where mass hysteria harmed the lives of many people, including men and children. Today, we are familiar with the term witch hunt. It is a common refrain used by politicians, celebrities, and news outlets. However, this phrase was not introduced in the English lexicon until 1692 during a 7-month ordeal known as the Salem witch trials. All right. So, what caused the early modern witch hunts? The American and the European witch hunts of the early modern era had a significant impact on Western society, politics, and culture. So what caused this? In the spring of 1692, 2 young girls from a seemingly a village, the early part of the early 13th colony village and the Massachusetts Bay Colony began to display increasingly disturbing behavior, claiming strange visions and experiencing fits. When a local doctor diagnosed the girls as suffering from the malevolent effects of the supernatural, they set in motion a series of events that would alter the course of American culture, judicial, and political history. The ensuing witch hunt would result in the execution of 19 men, women, and children, along with the deaths of at least 6 others. and the suffering, torment, and calamity of the entire community. The story of this village is one that lodged itself into the cultural mindset of people everywhere as a cautionary tale against the dangers of extremism, groupthink, and false accusation. Okay. But the events surrounding the witch trials of Salem in 1962 were not in any way unique or isolated. Instead, they were just one very small chapter in the much longer story of the witch hunts that took place all across Europe. In America, in the early modern period, which the European witch hunts reached a height between 1560 and 1650, it is nearly impossible to determine a correct estimate of how many people were tried and executed for witchcraft during this time. However, the general consensus is that the witch hunt spanned the results of deaths between 40,000 and 60,000 people. My goodness. So, what happened and all of this is a good conversation to talk about and to reflect on to reflect on us as a society, to think about this and look toward this and say, hey, this is a learning process of how to view and think about things in the future. And I can't stress that enough. If we look toward the history and we really see it from as much as we possibly can from a objectable lens, it can really help and broaden our perspectives about a lot of things. And for the better. So here we go. I'm breaking down and I'm going back now to the 6 facts. So witches' tests could not be passed. Witch tests were a relic of the witch trials in Europe, which, as I mentioned, which peaked during the medieval era but continued when Massachusetts occurs its witches. Which also, to add on to this, with the medieval era, it was, even though it's depicted as an era where people they weren't evolutionized in thinking, to put it that briefly. There was golden ages, golden eras in this time. And needless to say, it's interesting how those juxtapositions clash with one another to make it seem as if this was just an era, a dark age of thoughts and ideas. It's something to say how that reflects. And then, it's also something to say how this reflects, too, about the time that we are living. How will our era be looked upon towards other people in the future? All right. Clergymen conceived the test, and the accused witches would be tested until they failed, proving their practice of witchcraft. There was no way around the test, and no one could pass every test. One of the most famous tests of the Salem witch trials was the swimming test. The idea was centered around the purity of water. If the accused floated, they were guilty, as the water was thought to reject evil. If they sank, they were deemed innocent, but often drowned. All right, so While the swimming of the test is quite well known, more obscure and factical witch tests were often used against those accused in Salem. This included the witch cake test, the touch test, the incantation test, and the weight test. The witch cake test was likely the strangest given to Salem's accused witches. It was in most cases impossible to pass this test, as many would likely suffer adverse effects by being force-fed a cake laced with bodily fluids. My goodness. Essentially, the witch was told to bake a cake with their victim's urine and fed said cake to a dog. Dogs were considered faithful to witches as familiars, so as the dog suffered adverse effects and the effects of the afflicted continued, it proved the accused guilty of witchcraft. The touch test was simple. The accused witch was ordered to touch the victim, and if the victim felt pain, the accused was considered guilty. Likewise, the incantation test dedicated that if an accused witch asked the devil to remove the affliction of their alleged victims, and the victims were cured, the accused was guilty. It is easy, as it's said in this source, it is easy in hindsight to see how the alleged victims used the test to their advantage. They could lie with their abandon, and the witch would still appear guilty. Finally, the least foolproof was the weight test. Witches were thought to be impossibly light, and the court would weigh the accused against the Bible. They were a witch if they were more lightweight than the Bible, which they never were. If they weighed more than the book, which they always did, the court simply moved on to another test, citing the malice power of the devil for this weight test. So, on to the second fact. No one was burned at the stake. When one thinks of the Salem trials, it is easy to imagine that witches were all burned at the stake. This is actually a trope from the European witch trials. Being burned at the stake was an age-old punishment reserved for heretics. Joan of Arc was burned at the stake, as were several thousand others accused of heresy during the Middle Ages. The tradition continued throughout Europe for several hundred years until the 18th century. This style of execution is commonly thought of in conjunction with witch trials because of the tens of thousands of witch executions in Europe. Many were burned at the stake. However, in Salem, no execution was carried out by burning the accused alive. The majority were executed by hanging, and one man named Giles Corey was crushed under rocks until he died. Many more accused witches either died in prison or were pardoned, as many of the women accused were pregnant. They were often given a stay of execution or acquitted. 2 babies, Sarah Good's daughter and Elizabeth Proctor's son, were born while their mothers were in prison. However, Mercy Good's daughter died sometime before her mother's execution. On to number 3, the youngest accused witch was 4 years old. While most of the accused witches were adults, even elderly adults, one exception is Dorothy Good. Dorothy Good was 4 or 5 when she was charged and arrested for witchcraft. Her mother, Sarah Good, was an accused witch who would be one of the women accused by hanging her for supposed devil worship. Dorothy was said to be animalistic and deranged, traits she acquired from consorting with the devil. Despite probably having no idea what was happening, little Dorothy confused to her supposed crimes when questioned by the magistrates. Her testimony that she had seen her mother with Satan also served as a confusion which allowed the court to detain her. Dorothy spent several months in prison and was released on bond after admission. Her mother was hanged while Dorothy was in jail. My goodness. Man, this stuff is really something to look back and think about. Gee whiz. Okay. Courts allowed for spectatorship is what I'm gathering from this testimonies. The evidence used against the accused witches was wholly circumstantial. No one could actually produce Satan to appear in court, and the supposed victims had no proof beyond their words. This meant that the spectral evidence was admissible in the Salem witch trial. Spectral evidence relied on victims' testimonies. That's what it actually is. Sorry about that. Sorry about that misinterpretation on my end. So spectral evidence relied on victims' testimony that they had seen the accused in the form of their spirit or their shape, and they had harmed the victims in this manner, and the accused could provide no alibi for the spirit. Thus, most of the evidence used against the victim witches was spectral. Victims claimed the witch's spirit attacked them, and of course admitted that these attacks was evidence. Many ministers at the time, such as the father and the son duo, increased the Cotton Mather, disagreed over the use of the spectral evidence. Increased Mather denounced it as use, not because it was possible, but because the devil could not use anyone's spirit to do harm. Eventually, the evidence was outlawed in the Salem courts, which overturned many convictions, allowed several accused witches to go free, and hastened the end of the trials. Most of the accusers were children. While many accused witches turned on one another, those who were afflicted or victimized by the supposed witches were relatively young. Their first accusers were Elizabeth Parris and Abigail Williams, aged 9 and 11. The girls were the daughters of the nieces of the Puritan minister, Reverend Samuel Parris, and they fell ill. They blamed the symptoms on an enslaved woman in Parris's house named Tibia. Many other young women followed suit, the eldest being 20. They accused supposed witches of afflicting them with all manner of symptoms. In reality, the accusers were sick. It was due to contaminated drinking water. And that was another thing, too, that the drinking waters, the well was contaminated with something. And that linked to all of these witchcraftery, as they deemed, examples, proof that they were witches, when in reality it was just ailments. So, rather than sorcery, the reasons for accusing their neighbors were possibly neighborly spats or illnesses that they could not understand. Many accused also turned on their neighbors, believing they may have been spared if they diverted the Magites' attention to others. And lastly, the trial only stopped when the governor's wife was accused. The governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony at the time of the Salem witch trials was William Pepys. His close relationship with a few ministers and wealthy community members made his involvement with the trials unavoidable. Still, it seemed that Pepys mostly washed his hands of the hysteria and distanced himself from those in charge. However, he did not disallow his officials from continuing their inquest. One such official was Pepys' Lieutenant Governor William Salton, also named Chief Justice of the Investigation, also named Chief. So he was the Justice of the Investigation into Salem's accused witches. Salton was known for speedy trials and quick executions, so bucking to the traditions of the time. Salton was encouraged by the Church to be cautious yet swift in his convictions, which he took to heart. Salton was not only bloodthirsty but powerful. He took over most of Pepys' executive powers, while the governor assisted in the aspects of Maine and the colony defense against the French and Native American insertion. While Pepys returned from Maine, he found his lieutenant governor had made quite a mess of things, executing 20 people and condemning 8 more during the week when Pepys returned. Salton had ordered the digging of graves for 8 newly accused witches. These accusations increased well beyond 8 and higher, and including these witches that were accused was Pepys' wife. When Pepys learned of the allegation against his wife, he finally decreed that this evidence would not be permitted in the Salem witch trials. The 8 witches Salton had planned to convict were cleared, and the lieutenant governor abandoned his post. Soon after, in February of 1693, all accused witches were pardoned and released from prison by May. Wow, that's really, all of this information is really something to think about. I would like to know what all of you think, too, about the aspect of Salem witch trials and how that leads into different aspects of history, even how that also, in the realm of the era that we live in today, how these different aspects about the Salem witch trial, how does this reflect in today's era, Feel free to give me comments of your thoughts, either through email, either through Substack, and of course, YouTube. I would really like to know what you all think, because this is raw. This is just something. It's just insanity at its highest extent. And, of course, it's just been worse things that have happened throughout history. But this is just, wow. It's crazy. All right. This reaches the end of the Harboring Light. Tune in, turn up, and absolutely take care out there. Bye-bye now.